view it. Uh, First of all, let me describe myself, and then I'll ask our speaker to describe himself, and then say a few other things about upcoming programs. We describe ourselves for people who may be vision impaired. I am told that I look younger than I am. I have gray hair. I'm on the verge of retirement. I'm behind me are various antiquities collected by my wife. Natan, you want to describe yourself?
Sure. I'm also told I look younger than I am. Let's see. I'm balding and with a very short beard and square dark blue glasses and a yellow yarmulke with some bookshelves behind me, and I'm wearing a gray shirt and a gray sweater.
Thank you. I'll introduce Natan beyond his self-description in just a moment. But first of all, one more housekeeping matter. We will have questions at the end. We will use the raise hand function, which is in the lower right of your screen where it says reactions. You click on that and you'll see the ability to raise your hand, and then puts the questions in order. Now, some upcoming programs for New Lair House. On May 15th, Eddie Portnoy of YIVO will be giving a talk on Jews and cannabis entitled Am Yisrael High, which is a fascinating discussion of cannabis all the way from the Bible actually to our present day, based on an exhibition that he's opening actually tonight at YIVO. Secondly, sometime in late May, we're going to do a program on Jewish views of abortion, which, as you all know, is all of a sudden on all of our minds. And it's part of the mission of New Lair House to bring issues that are of topical importance to our audience and to discuss them from different points of view. Now, our speaker tonight, Natan Meir, is, in my view, one of the most important and original historians working on the Jews of Eastern Europe. A book that I had the privilege to publish as a co-editor of a series at Stanford University Press, Stepchildren of the Shtetl, is a remarkable study of orphans, the disabled, beggars, and others on the margins of Jewish society in Eastern Europe. It's a fantastic book, and we're very fortunate that Natan in the fall will give a course based on that book. Natan's first book is on the Jews of Kiev, which is what we're going to be hearing about tonight. Natan teaches at Portland State University in Oregon. And that book is also a very, very important study. And of course, now has become extremely topical given events in Ukraine. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Natan.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you for having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I'm sad about the circumstances that make Kiev a topic of heightened interest these days, but very glad of the opportunity to be able to talk about the history of the city and its Jews with you all. So what I'm going to do is talk about mostly about the Jews of Tsarist Kiev. So starting around the middle of the 19th century and up to World War I, which is what my book covers. The book is called Kiev, Jewish Metropolis. And I'll actually, I'll share my screen now with you. So let's see, I'm never sure what to click on, but I'll try this one. Does that look right? Okay. And then we'll continue beyond the scope of my book, beyond World War I into the early Soviet period and through the 20th century to today. Although, as I mentioned, my focus will be on that earlier period from around 18, well, you can see the dates right there on the book cover, 1859 to 1914. The title of the book, obviously, Kiev, Jewish Metropolis. If I had to title it today, I might choose something different. I think I was a little naive about the extent to which Russification, the Russification that we're going to talk about tonight in historical terms, the extent to which that process had really influenced the city that I was living in the aughts, in 2000, 2001, 2002, when I was doing my research there. Kiev, as you probably know, is the Russian name for the city. The Ukrainian name, which all major media outlets have now adopted, is Kyiv, Kyiv. And the classical Hebrew name that was sometimes used by Jews is Kyiv. In Yiddish, it was called Kiev, just as in Russian. So it had a number of different names, and I've titled my lecture in that way tonight to signal that Kiev is, of course, not the only name for this city. During the period that we're going to be talking about tonight, for the most part, in the Tsarist period, of course, it was ruled by the Russian Empire, and it was described very often at the time as a Russian city, even though there were Ukrainians living in the city, and the hinterland, the countryside around Kiev, was heavily Ukrainian. And then during the Soviet period, of course, the unofficial official language was Russian as well, although Ukrainian was sometimes used at times. So it's a very complicated history in terms of the ethnic makeup of the city, the symbolism of the city for different groups, for Russians, for Ukrainians, for Jews, and we'll talk about that symbolism tonight, and I hope it will help enrich your understanding of the city today, which of course is very much in the headlines. So if we want to go all the way back into the Middle Ages, we'll find that there were Jews living in medieval Kiev, in the Principality of Kievan Rus. We have evidence that Jews were living in the city around the 11th century, but it's very, very fragmentary. And our story really begins in the late 18th century, when the region around Kiev was appended to the Russian Empire, and Jews began to settle in Kiev in that period, in the late 18th century. As it happened, the Christian merchants in Kiev at the time were not at all happy with that development, because Jewish merchants began to be very active in Kiev. And as a result of petitions by the Christians to the Tsarist government, the Jews were expelled in 1827. Now, if you look at the map, what you'll see here is this area that I'm showing you with my cursor is all within the Russian Empire. And the area here is the Pale, or provinces within the Pale of Settlement. That was the region in the western part of the Russian Empire that part of which had previously been part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the partitions of Poland, at which point Poland itself disappeared. It was essentially swallowed up by the three countries around it, and most of it went to the Russian Empire. And so some of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth then became the Pale of Settlement, the area where Jews were permitted to live. They were not allowed to live beyond the Pale of Settlement. And so generally, when we think about cities that Jews were interested in settling in the Russian Empire that weren't in the Pale, we often talk about Moscow and St. Petersburg, because they were, as I'm sure you're aware, they were quite far from the Pale of Settlement, And Jews actually had to have special permission, or they had to, after 1861, they had to be a member of certain categories of certain occupational or guild categories to live in those cities. But Kiev was also excluded from the Pale of Settlement, which is not as an organic development as the other two cities, because Kiev is right here. And it's, at that time, was the capital of Kiev province, and in fact was the administrative capital of what was called the southwest region of the Russian Empire. This entire region here, Kiev, Podolia, and Volhynia provinces, these are today, of course, part of Ukraine, and at the time, very heavily populated by Ukrainian peasants, but also very heavily Jewish. So it would have made sense to have Kiev, because geographically Kiev was in the Pale of Settlement, but administratively it was excluded from the Pale of Settlement. And that was in part because of this history of expulsion, that this history starting from 1827, when Jews were not permitted to live in the city, mostly because the local Christian merchants did not want their competition. But it was also because Kiev held particular religious and historical value for the Russian Empire. And I'll come back to this slide in a second, but I just want to show you a few images of the Jerusalem of Russia, which is what Kiev was sometimes called. Such was its religious significance for Russian Orthodox believers. We have several medieval monasteries and churches that date back to the 11th century. The one on the right here, you can see the Kievo-Pечерsk Lavra, which is the monastery of the caves, which is a complex of churches and other institutions that date back centuries. Very, very important pilgrimage destination for Orthodox Christians. So Kiev itself was a pilgrimage center for Eastern Christianity. You can see here also St. Michael's Golden Domed Monastery on the left, and St. Sophia's Cathedral, which is also dates back to the 11th century. So Kiev was, as I mentioned, a very important religious center. And so as Jews began to migrate into the city, Russian nationalists used various themes, drew on various themes in their anger at what they called the conquest of Kiev. And one of these themes was the religious nature of the city, the Christian nature of the city. How could you allow thousands of Jews to settle in this kind of a Christian center for Eastern Orthodoxy? So nonetheless, starting in the 1860s, we have Jews migrating to Kiev in relatively large numbers. We go from 3,000 to 9,000 to almost 14,000 in 1874. Now, in theory, only, as I mentioned before, only certain categories of Jews were permitted to settle in Kiev. There was a certain kind of merchant in the Russian Empire, category of merchant. There was first guild merchant, second guild merchant, and you had to have enough money to be able to essentially buy your way into one of these guild categories. And those Jews who were wealthy enough to do so were able to settle in Kiev without any restrictions whatsoever. Others had to apply for a special residence permit, and they were only allowed to live in certain neighborhoods of the city. So some historians, some Russian Jewish historians in the late 19th, early 20th century, they called Kiev the last existing ghetto, because this was the last place, or one of the last places in the Russian Empire where there were neighborhoods that Jews were required to live in, and other neighborhoods that were off limits to Jews. Now, if you were a Jew who wanted to go to St. Petersburg or Moscow, that was quite a difficult thing to do. if you didn't have the right permit to do so. They were far from the Pale of Settlement, and it was generally very difficult to settle in those places illegally. Kiev was a different category because it was so close to these densely populated regions of the Pale of Settlement. There were like literally shtetls, just across the municipal line, and so it was very easy for Jews either to come in for the day or to come in under the guise of, let's say, working as a clerk for an industrialist or an entrepreneur, and there were plenty of Jews who came in without any permit whatsoever, or even the ruse of a permit. They were living there totally illegal, and that was one of the kind of characteristics of Jewish life in Kiev, was that it was generally very unstable, and there were many raids on illegal Jews that happened on a weekly or monthly basis. The police were known to take regular bribes from Jews who were living in the city illegally, and this was kind of part of Jewish life in the city. So Jewish life grows very rapidly in Kiev in the 1870s and the 1880s, to the point where they are at least 10 or 11% of the population in the mid 1870s, probably more because of all of the illegal Jews who were living in the city. And why are they coming to Kiev? Because it was a really important center, and it was growing all the time. It was growing in part because of the opening of the Southwestern Railroad, and Kiev became an important stop on the railroad network in the Russian Empire, and especially in this part that you can see here on the map. Kiev becomes a center for the sugar beet trade. The primary agricultural product at that time in this region are sugar beets, and these are processed and they're marketed out of Kiev and its environs. It also becomes a grain shipping center. Grain is often shipped from this area through Kiev down to the port of Odessa. It's an administrative center because there are important government officials who are based in Kiev. It's also an educational center because there is a university that's established in Kiev. This is known at the time as St. Vladimir University. And I showed you an image. There's an image here, a contemporary image from the early 20th century of that university. The building still stands. It looks exactly the same. It's now called Taras Shevchenko University, named after the very important Ukrainian poet. And Kiev was also becoming an industrial center as well. So there were a lot of jobs available in Kiev, and Jews moved there for the economic opportunities, just as at that time in the Russian Empire, Jews are moving to cities, not only to Kiev, but also to places like Odessa or to Warsaw or to Minsk to find economic opportunity. And of course, some of them are also leaving the Russian Empire altogether, mostly moving to the United States, also to seek greener pastures. Now, as you can see from the breakdown from the 1897 census, over half of the population in that year was Russian, and about 23% is Ukrainian. We can't rely on these figures 100%. They're not ironclad, and it's difficult to know exactly how they categorize Russian and Ukrainian, because there were certainly Ukrainians in Kiev who spoke Russian and who sometimes spoke it as their everyday language of everyday speech, which is what they were looking for in the census. And that's how they categorize language. And so those Ukrainians who spoke Russian most of the time would have been classified as Russian. And so this probably undercounts the Ukrainian population in the city. So we might say it was anywhere between 25 and 35%, still obviously a minority, right? Because most of the Ukrainian peasants at this time are still living on the land. They are not heavily urbanized. So the Russians who are living in Kiev, some of them have come from Russia proper to the Ukrainian lands because of economic opportunities in the city. And of course, the Jews, we've already said, tend to come from around this region. The Kiev province had the largest Jewish population of any province in the Pale of Settlement. About 250,000 Jews lived in Kiev province. And so we have Jews coming from very nearby, which includes, by the way, a ring of towns around Kiev, which were Hasidic centers. Some of these towns we're still familiar with today. Chernobyl, for example, that was a famous Hasidic dynasty. Rotmistrovska was another one. And we know, and a third one, the Talnoya in Russian, or the Talner Hasidim in Yiddish. And we know that there were Jewish migrants coming from these towns to Kiev, obviously very nearby, but Jews also came from much further away. We know, in fact, that there were also Lithuanian Jews who came from hundreds of miles away to Kiev. So I just want to talk for a few minutes about the geography of the city and where Jews settled. Kiev is a very, very hilly city. So the neighborhoods are defined by the hills and the valleys and some certain ravines as well that you can find. In fact, we're all familiar with the infamous Babin Yar or Babi Yar, and Yar in Ukrainian means ravine. There are many different ravines around the city. And when you get to know the city, you discover that it can be complicated to get from one place to another, even though it seems like as the crow flies on the map, it should be very, very quick. But in fact, it's difficult because there's a steep hill or there's a ravine or something like that. In any case, this is the very, very center here of Kiev, which was called Starokievskaya, or the old town, old Kiev. And this is where you would find Khreshchatyk, or in Ukrainian, Khreshchatyk, which is the main boulevard of Kiev. Still today, it's the main boulevard. It doesn't look anything like this because it was rebuilt in Stalinist style after World War II, but it is still the main boulevard of central Kiev. In this area of Starokievskaya and also a little bit to the south, what was called Dvartsovaya, sometimes also called Lipki, because Lipki, named after the lime trees, that's what they're called in Russian. There was a beautiful tree-lined streets in that area. This was the area that was off limits to most Jews because they were not permitted to live in the central districts of Kiev. So this area down here, Dvartsovaya, was filled with mansions like the one you see in this picture here of the Ginsburg residence. Some of these mansions belong to the industrialists and the entrepreneurs who were the elite of the Jewish community. And they were among the richest men in the empire, not just in Kiev, not just in the Ukrainian region, but in the entire empire. So they were fabulously wealthy. Meantime, most of the Jewish population was quite poor, and they tended to live over here in the port area, which is very low-lying and tended to flood. There's two neighborhoods of importance here, Podol or Podil in Ukrainian, and Ploskaya or Ploska in Ukrainian. Again, very poor neighborhoods. Almost, some of the descriptions make them sound like slums. And then on the other end of Kiev to the south, there's a neighborhood called Libid, which is another Jewish neighborhood. What do I mean by Jewish neighborhood? These areas here might be about 40% Jewish, and then Libid was about 25% Jewish. So we're not talking anything like 50, 60, 70%, but these were still high percentages for a city like Kiev, which had not had any Jews prior to 1859 living within its borders. You can see here on this, the lower central part of the slide, a view of the Podol or Podil neighborhood, which again is that the port neighborhood. The most heavily Jewish area was all the way up here to the north. And there was even a market in Kiev, which was called the Yevreysky Bazaar, the Jewish Bazaar or the Jewish market. And that was located a little bit to the west of the city. one thing I want to point out, which is interesting, and we'll talk for in a minute about the choral synagogue that was established in Kiev in the late 19th century. If you go to Kiev today, maybe some of you have been there, you'll know that the choral synagogue still stands, and it is in a very central location, which is exactly what the wealthy families that established it wanted. But in actuality, if we look at the administrative boundaries of the neighborhoods at the time, the area, the corner where the choral synagogue was established was the northernmost tip of this Libid neighborhood. So in actuality, it was not located in central Kiev, administratively speaking. It was located in that neighborhood where Jews were permitted to settle, and they kind of pushed the boundary as much as they could to ensure that the synagogue would be in a more central location. But even these very, very wealthy men could not convince the administration of the city at the time to allow them to establish a synagogue in the central neighborhood. That was simply considered a bridge too far. So Jews played a very important role in the development of Kiev as a whole. Obviously, as you can imagine, and we'll talk about this a little bit, they also played an important role in the development of an organized Jewish community itself and the community's institutions. But it's important to understand how central a role men like, I don't know where that, there's supposed to be a caption under this picture here, and for some reason it totally disappeared. This is Lazar Brodsky, this man on the upper right. The Brodsky family was the wealthiest family in Kiev. They were sugar barons, and everyone knew that the name Brodsky was equal to or equated to sugar. That was kind of common knowledge, not only in Kiev, but throughout the Russian Empire. Again, fabulously wealthy men. And they underwrote many of the city's institutions. They were, I don't know how it works in the Bay Area, but here in Portland, we have a few families who are the philanthropists who give to every institution, especially in the Jewish community, and there's one in particular. And you know that if you're establishing any kind of organization, you just have to go to them. So it was the same way here. You went to Brodsky, and you went to some of the other families as well. There were a few other wealthy families. And so if we look, I'll just go for a second to the next slide, and then I'll come back. There's some very important institutions still standing today in Kiev that were established either with the help of or entirely with the funding of the Brodsky family and other families. The main covered market of Kiev in the very center of the city, which is still standing today, it's still a market. It was called the Municipal Covered Market, and then later on it became known as the Bessarabsky Market. That was funded by the Brodsky family entirely. The Bacteriological Institute, which was a very important scientific institute, research institute that was established because Kiev was hit so many times by cholera epidemics and by other epidemics, that was established by the Brodskys. There was also a commercial institute that served actually many Jewish students who were unable to enter into St. Vladimir University because of quotas, because of Jewish quotas. And so this was established with the help of Jewish funding from the Jewish families, and many Jewish students ended up attending the commercial institute as a way to get a degree, a higher education degree. Let me go back to my previous slide. Okay, so as I mentioned before, these wealthy families also underwrote the Jewish institutions of the city, which included the choral synagogue that I mentioned earlier. There were, of course, traditional shuls, traditional prayer houses in the city, many of which were illegal. They were kind of underground. And in fact, I wrote an article a few years back about how we can try to track down and identify these secret prayer houses and their symbolic presence in Kiev as the mother of Russian cities, as it was sometimes called, or as I mentioned earlier, the Jerusalem of Russia. But in this case, these more acculturated, more Russified Jewish merchants and industrialists, who of course came from traditional backgrounds, traditional homes where traditional, or let's say, piety was observed, where Yiddish was spoken. But as they moved into the city and moved in the circles with kind of bourgeois circles with Russians and to some extent with Ukrainians, of course they naturally wanted to fit into their surroundings, and so they themselves often spoke Russian. They sent their children to Russian schools, and as was the case throughout the Russian Empire and to some extent throughout Europe, they built a synagogue that along Western lines, a synagogue that they felt would be kind of more acceptable to the surrounding society, one that would, let's say, in the words of their contemporaries, would look a little bit less medieval. These are not my words; these are their words. They would look a little bit less medieval to their peers, and look more respectable. And so they made. I mean, this is an Orthodox synagogue, of course, but they made minor changes, which at the time would have been considered really quite major. Certain changes in the seating of the synagogue. Of course, it was pews, as you would find in a church. There was a choir, which was also quite an innovation at the time, a cantor, and all of this was kind of emblematic of this type of upwardly mobile bourgeoisie. In fact, these are the men that we're talking about here. These elite families are really, they're more than bourgeois, they're more than haute bourgeois. I mean, they are really very wealthy, but they were also members of the Jewish middle class who attended the choral synagogue as well. Another institution that I want to mention that was very, very important at the time was the Jewish hospital, which you can see here on the lower right. This is actually only one ward of about 10 or 15 buildings that were eventually built over the course of about 20 or 25 years. It was a huge complex at the time. The buildings are mostly still standing, but they're obviously used for other purposes now, although some of them are still medical institutions. The Jewish hospital was one of the most important medical complexes in the entire Russian Empire. It was completely up to date technologically with all of the latest equipment, and it was a symbol of the Jews of Kiev in a few different ways. One of these ways was its contribution to the health of the city as a whole, just like the Bacteriological Institute that I showed you the photo of a few minutes ago. I think the idea, and this is something that I argue in my book, the idea of the Jewish hospital was not only to serve as a hospital for Jews who at that time ordinarily would not want to go to a Christian hospital because first of all, because of the kosher food would not be available, and they were also obviously concerned about anti-Semitism and possibly being proselytized to. But even more than that, the idea of the Jewish hospital was an institution that was going to serve all of the people of Kiev, no matter what their religious and ethnic background, and it was funded by the Jewish community. So this was an example of how Jews contributed to Russian society, right? It was obviously meant to be in opposition to widespread anti-Semitic belief that Jews were very insular, very clannish, that they only worried about themselves, and that they were really quite a selfish people. That was the reigning stereotype at the time, and this was meant to combat that stereotype. This was meant to signal to the larger Russian society, of course, to Kiev as a city, that Jews were a beneficial element in the city. And you can see that not only in the Jewish hospital, but also in those other institutions that I mentioned earlier. So to a large extent, in the first few decades of Jewish existence in the city, it was really in many ways about the elite, right? There were, of course, tens of thousands of ordinary Jews living in the city, but because of the unique nature of the Jewish community, of Jewish existence in the city, as I mentioned earlier, it was quite an unstable existence. and ordinary Jews often did not know if they were going to be able to stay in the city from one day to the next. And of course, the wealthiest Jewish families were there for decades, and they had very important connections with the local Christian elite and also with the representatives of the Tsarist government. And so they were really the ones who essentially decided what the community was going to look like for quite a long time. After 1905 or so, this begins to change. You start to have a much more vocal Jewish community, especially because of movements like Zionism and the Bund, the Jewish Socialist Party. There's a very large student presence, Jewish student presence in Kiev as well, and the Jewish students have an important impact on the nature of the Jewish community. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail right now, but something that I spend a lot of time explaining in the book is how this elite governance of the Jewish community was eventually challenged by both representatives of the Jewish middle class and also, to some extent, the Jewish workers. And there was something of a revolution in Jewish communal governance in Kiev at the time. What I'll say now more generally is that there were circles of both Zionism and Bundism in Kiev. There was also a Yiddish literary circle that was small in numbers, but had a very important influence on the subsequent development of Yiddish literature. You've probably also heard, I imagine, of the pogroms that took place in the Ukrainian regions of the Russian Empire during the period that we're talking about. 1881 was the first wave of pogroms, and then there was another wave around the time of the first Russian Revolution in 1905. And as you can imagine, these had an important impact on, a deleterious influence on Jewish life in Kiev. I argue that the 1881 pogrom, of course, it came as a shock, but the community recovered from it relatively quickly, and we don't see much trace of the impact of that pogrom in subsequent decades in the 1880s and the 1890s. But the 1905 pogrom was much more severe. It was a very different kind of pogrom. It was bloodier. Many people were killed in that pogrom, and it was the Jewish community was never the same after 1905. And Kiev Jews really lived from day to day wondering whether another pogrom was going to take place in the city. So it's a the last decade or so of Tsarist Kiev for Jews is a very difficult decade. Another low moment is the Beilis affair, which is the infamous trial of Mendel Beilis. This was a blood libel where Mendel Beilis, a Kiev Jew, was accused in the ritual murder of a Christian child. The trial itself was held in Kiev, and it was a huge media affair around the Russian Empire and actually around the world. And obviously it affected Kiev Jews as well, who were kind of in the spotlight during those years. I gave you here on this slide also a photograph of Max Mandelstam, who I think not well known today, but he was a very important Zionist leader at the time. He was actually an ophthalmologist by training and served as kind of a father figure for Kiev Jews for many decades. He had settled in the city at a relatively early stage, and then became known as a defender of Jewish rights for Kiev Jews, and very active, of course, as I mentioned, in the Zionist movement as well. I have a short quote here from Shalom Aleicham's memoir called "From the Fair," which illustrates well the way that Jews, or at least some Jews in Kiev, had to live because of the constant raids by the police that tried to uncover Jews who were living in the city illegally. And in many cases, these Jews were put into handcuffs, taken to police stations, kept overnight in squalid conditions, and then marched out of the city in chains the next day. And this was something that happened on a regular basis. The threat of police raids and expulsion, writes Shalom Aleichem, didn't prevent anyone from going to Kiev. The Russian proverb says, if you're afraid of the wolf, don't set foot in the forest. But despite everyone's fear of the midnight inspections, they traveled to Kiev anyway. The innkeeper saw to it that the inspections proceeded smoothly and that, God forbid, no unkosher merchandise, in other words, illegal Jews, was discovered. How? Simple. The innkeeper greased those palms that had to be greased. He got advance word of a raid and knew what to do. The forbidden goods were hidden, one in an attic, another in a cellar, someone else in a clothes closet, a fourth in a chest, and a fifth in a place where no one ever dreamed that a human being could be hidden. Best of all, when they crawled back into God's world from their hiding places, everyone laughed at the whole thing like children at hide and seek. If worse came to worse, they consoled themselves with a sigh. Oh, so what? We've lived through worse times and bigger Hamans. Obviously, a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek depiction of what was probably not a particularly pleasant experience. And as I mentioned, this happened on a regular basis. And of course, the bribes for the police were a very important part of life in Kiev for many Jews as well. Now, I want to, since we're coming to the end of our time, in a few minutes, I'm going to attempt an overview of a century or so of Jewish life from World War I up until the present day. Now, we know that there were already a very large number of Jews by, let's say, 1910 or so, 1912 in Kiev, possibly around 75,000 out of a total of 450,000. So the Jewish population has already grown significantly by this time. And during World War I, it explodes. And that's because there's such chaos and such upheaval during World War I that many of the Ukrainian peasants who had been living in Kiev, they decide to leave the city for the countryside because for them, that's the safest place. The Jews, by contrast, who are facing the very real possibility of all kinds of violence in the shtetls where they're living, in Kiev province or in other nearby provinces, they find the city to be the safest place to come to. So we have Jews streaming into Kiev during World War I to try to find some refuge, some measure of safety during the war. You may know that there was a short-lived Ukrainian People's Republic that was declared after the Bolshevik Revolution that existed for just a few short years. It held some very positive potential for the Jews of Ukraine, and in fact, there were Jews who were involved in the establishment of that independent Ukrainian country. But because of the chaos that followed World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Civil War, that country did not last for very long. And ultimately, as we know, the Soviet Union is established with the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic as one of its constituent republics. And so Kiev becomes a Soviet city. And the Jews of Kiev, of course, like all the Jews of the Soviet Union during this period, must gradually become accustomed to this new regime that they're living in. Some, especially younger Jews, were very excited, very enthusiastic about the possibilities that were offered to them by this revolutionary moment. And a really good example of that is the Kulturliga, which was established in the revolutionary years, in the early Soviet years. This was a Yiddishist circle that was very much cutting edge at the time, focusing on literary activity and artistic and other kinds of cultural activity. You can see here a photograph of students and teachers in the music school of the Kulturliga in the mid-1920s. The Jewish population at this point is double that what it was around 1910 or so. So it's reached about 130,000, which is about a third of the total population of the city. And so we've reached a state that's similar to Odessa. Odessa was also known as a very, very Jewish city, fully one-third Jewish around the same period. Kiev was also important in Soviet Jewish history because it was home to the Institute of Jewish Proletarian Culture, which was a state-sponsored institution, a state-sponsored research institute that engaged in research of all kinds relating to what it called proletarian Yiddish culture, which essentially was Jewish culture that was expressed in the Yiddish language. That's a whole other fascinating chapter of Soviet Jewish life that I don't have time to go into right now, but I can talk about that in the questions if people are interested. During World War II, some of the Jewish population of Kiev managed to either be evacuated because there was state-sponsored evacuation of some parts of the population, especially those who were considered vital for the war effort. And some managed to flee before the Nazis arrived. Of course, we know the fate of the majority of those who did not manage to flee. Tens of thousands of Jews were murdered in the killing ravine in Babin Yar. But despite those horrific losses, there were Jews who returned to Kiev after the war, and these are obviously very approximate population figures, but we think there were still hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Kiev in the decades after World War II. Of course, Jewish religious and cultural expression is very, very limited in these post-war decades. Any Jewish life often has to exist underground, and the focus is frequently on the killing site of Babin Yar as a kind of collective cri de coeur of the Jews of Kiev and the Soviet Union more broadly, who were often not permitted to memorialize their dead in the ways that they wanted to in the post-war years. So that's obviously very brief summary of Jewish life in Kiev after World War I and after the Bolshevik Revolution. I want to conclude by giving you a very optimistic picture of Jewish life in Ukraine and in Kiev in particular, of course, up until February 24th of this year. Kiev has had a very, very vibrant Jewish cultural life. Of course, as we know, many, many Jews decided to emigrate from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But those who remained, and many of those who remained in Ukraine, decided to consciously commit themselves to the building of a multi-ethnic, democratic Ukraine. And that, in fact, has overall, that's been the trajectory of the past few decades. We have the establishment of a number of important Jewish cultural and research institutions in Kiev. I've mentioned here the Institute Judaiki, which is the Institute of Jewish Studies, which is a research center for both academic and community-facing Jewish studies. There's an academic institute at one of the main universities of Kiev, which is called the University of Kiev Mohila Academy. The leader of that particular institute is a man by the name of Leonid Finberg, who is a prominent Ukrainian Jewish intellectual who was a dissident during the Soviet years and has been a very important leader in the Jewish community in the years of independent Ukraine. And just the last few years have seen the establishment of a Jewish community center, which is called the Halom Jewish Community Center. There's a photograph of it here. There's an Israeli Cultural Center. You may have heard and then you may have read in the news about a new memorial complex, somewhat controversial, which has been emerging at the Babin Yar site. And there are also still, in terms of religious life, of course, most post-Soviet Jews are not religiously observant, but there are several active synagogues. Of course, Chabad has also been very, very active in Kiev. And there's a photograph here on the bottom of a Chabad couple who have lived in Kiev for many decades, who unfortunately had to leave the city in March, after the war broke out. So I'm going to conclude by stating that despite the many tragedies of Jewish life in Kiev over the centuries, there was a very vibrant Jewish life in Kiev in the Tsarist period. And more recently, a different kind, but also very vibrant Jewish life in Kiev in independent Ukraine, which I know we all hope will be able to resume its growth and its dynamism whenever this tragic war comes to an end. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Natan. Let me just hang on. Let me bring up my own image and spotlight myself as well. So as I mentioned, we are going to take questions by using the raised hand function, if you will, lower right, if you have a question for Natan Meir on our subject. Can you, as we're waiting for people to think of questions, can you give us a sense of how many Jews there are in Kiev today? I mean, I don't mean today literally, because of course many people evacuated, but on the eve of the war.
The estimate that I've seen most often is between 20 and 25,000, and that's out of a total of course, definitions vary, right? Definitions of what does it mean to be Jewish in post-Soviet space. You can see estimates of the Jewish population of Ukraine anywhere from 45,000 to 200,000, and the real number is probably somewhere in between there. And I think that again, that 20 to 25,000 estimate is very, very rough.
Okay, Linda, please.
Sorry. I don't have a question. I want to thank you. My family came right at the beginning of the 20th century, between 1902 and 1905. But it didn't occur to me to ask questions until after the people who could have answered them were dead. And some of the contradictions, like being told, my great-grandmother used to tell me that they were not allowed in Kiev and they were caught and that they were marched home, that sort of thing. And yet your dates were back to 1858. And you've put it all together for me. So thank you very, very much.
I'm glad. I'm very glad.
Yeah, they lived in Rzeszów. And I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, but I can see on the map that it's just a short way down the Dnieper.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good pronunciation.
Oh, well, thank you.
I have to say something on this subject. My grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side came from Zhytomyr, and my grandmother would never talk about it. I couldn't get any stories out of her. It was a similar thing to what Linda said, and I suddenly woke up after February 24th and I said, I've never defined myself as Ukrainian. But actually, I am Ukrainian, at least on one side, which was a kind of a moment of revelation. I mean, I don't think Jews identify with Ukraine as such until maybe recent decades. So this is a very interesting development for us in terms of our identities, and so many of us come from that part of the world.
David,
Paul,
thank you.
Excuse me?
I was going to say, it was very similar in my family. I learned more about the negative things about the pogroms and all from what they wouldn't tell me.
Right. Yeah. Paul.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful talk. And my wife and I are really enjoying. One thing I was confused by it, but probably because I wasn't paying enough attention. The map that you showed us showed Kiev in what looked like a yellow zone or region, and it was much larger than Kiev, of course. I don't know, or yeah, Kiev. I don't know whether it included more than Kiev province, or gubernia or whatever, but Barbara's ancestor's shtetl was about 60 miles or so south and a little bit west of Kiev. And I'm wondering, was that not part of the Pale of Settlement?
Yes, it was. It certainly was. Yeah, I mean, it might have been a little bit confusing because what I showed you that what's highlighted on that particular map, which is taken from my book, is the southwest region of the Russian Empire, which, as I mentioned, was an administrative region. I mean, it's artificial, right? I mean, it basically corresponds to what historians call right bank Ukraine, which is to say the right bank of the Dnipro River. But that entire region, I mean, on the other side of the river from Kiev was Chernihiv province, and that was also part of the Pale settlement. So that whole Kiev was really right in the heart of the Pale. So the shtetl, the town that you mentioned, would definitely have been in the Pale. You would have had to travel quite a long ways from Kiev to get out of the Pale, actually.
Got it. Thanks.
Art.
Thank you very much, Natan, for this interesting talk.
Hi, Art.
Hi, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
I know that Golda Meir, fourth Prime Minister of Israel, was born in Kiev and left in 1906 following the anti-Semitism and the pogrom that you talked about. I wonder, since you had lived there for a couple of years, I didn't know this in 2000, the aughts, what did you get as a feeling of the Ukrainian people, of their history about that period of time and their view about Golda Meir and other people, Israel or Jews who had emigrated and left?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, officially there is pride in the fact that there were important Jews who lived in Kiev, because there are monuments in the city to where Golda Meir. There's a plaque on the outdoor, the building where Golda Meir lived as a girl, and there's a statue of Shalom Aleichem in the center of the city, and so these are attempts, again, officially to embrace the Jewish heritage of the city. And you can go to museums, historical museums in Kiev that are very well done and that very clearly talk about the anti-Semitism that existed in the city. Now, if we start asking about what do ordinary people know, what are they aware of, that I'm not really sure of. I don't know to what extent there's been good research done on that kind of those kinds of perceptions. I would say ordinary Kiev people know that the city has a Jewish history, for sure. They know that there were influential Jews who lived in Kiev. They also probably have heard of the pogroms. And I think it's generally that would be a very superficial understanding or knowledge of those events. But of course, if you're talking about the educated Kiev people who have read deeply in the history of the city, then they would probably have a much better understanding of the complexities of Jewish life, let's say. And I think one of the outstanding aspects of the Jewish Renaissance, I'll call it, in the last 30 years or so, has been to try to educate the city at large, and also tourists, about this rich Jewish heritage, which many people are not aware of. I mean, people are generally, if they know anything about Jewish Kiev, they know about Babin Yar, and that's about it, right? And so there's been an attempt to try to broaden people's understanding of Jewish history in the city.
Do you have any sense, Natan, of how the Jewish community viewed Zelensky before the war?
I don't actually. I don't really know. I've read a little bit about Zelensky. Obviously, we've all become familiar with him, and in the last few months. Um, he never disavowed his Jewish identity in any way, but it's not as if he actively affiliated as a Jew. It was kind of a typical post-Soviet Jew in that way. This is my ethnic background. That's pretty much it. There's nothing more to be said, right? And I think that the Jewish community, I don't know if, I've seen photographs of various Chabad rabbis meeting with him, leaders of the Jewish community. Presumably they saw him as one of their own, but whether he himself kind of acquiesced or kind of played a part in that perception of him as a Jewish president, I don't know. I'm not sure ordinary Jews in Ukraine would have seen him as anything other than an ordinary political figure. After all, just a few years ago, Ukraine was one of the only countries in the world that had both a Jewish president and a Jewish prime minister. Who would have thought, right? 100 years ago, it would have been completely unthinkable for that to be the case. And part of that is because Ukraine is truly now a multi-ethnic democracy. That is true, but it's also because the Soviet period allowed or forced Jews to, however you want to see it, to assimilate fully into Soviet society. And so to a great extent, these people are not seen as particularly different in any way. And I myself didn't experience anti-Semitism when I went to Ukraine. And surveys have shown that Ukrainian Jews feel actually pretty comfortable, pretty secure in Ukraine today.
Also a Jewish minister of defense and I think 1/4 Jewish mayor of Kiev.
That I didn't know about, the 1/4 Jewish.
Oh, yes. Now, Tom, before we go to the next question, could you put your book, could you put in the chat where people can get your book, the publisher and so forth?
Thank you.
I'll put both books, I suppose.
Actually, the
yeah.
way the chat is set up, I don't know if it goes to everybody. So why don't you just tell us?
Well, they're both available on that e-commerce site that all of you are familiar with. But the Kiev book is actually published by Indiana University Press. And so that is where you can get that particular book. Let me see if I can put it in the chat now, just for those who can see it. Yeah, that's the Indiana University Press website for the Kiev book. And for Stepchildren of the Shtetl, I will put that in the chat as well.
Let me, actually, 1 second. I need to reconfigure the chat so it goes to everyone. Hopefully this will work.
Oh, as far as I can tell, it's going to everyone.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Okay, Susan Diamond. You're muted.
Thank you. Yeah, right. Thank you so much. As everyone has said, this really meant a lot to me personally. Even though my mother's family wasn't from Kiev, I found their two towns, Kamenets, Podolsk, and Proskurov, which I couldn't find on today's map, but it was on your map that you showed. But my question is, if you know what's happened with the Ohel of Rebbe Levi Yitzhak of Berdichev and Rebbe Nachman, and maybe you can tell me, David, the Baal Shem was he in Ukraine?
Yeah, in Mezhbesh.
Yeah, Mezhbesh.
And so what I came in a little late. I don't know if you, have you talked about, have their Ohels been destroyed?
Not as far as I know. I was at the Ohel of Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev about 10 years ago. The cemetery's in pretty bad shape, but the Ohel was in decent shape. I have no reason to believe that they've been targeted during the war.
Right.
And in Uman, Reb Nachman's grave, I think, is, as far as I know, is in the same shape as it was before the war began. And also same for grave of the Baal Shem Tov in Mezbej.
Okay, and then the last, I was going to say that I knew so many Soviet emigres that came over in the late 60s, early 70s, and in particular, and some of them I was close to were from Odessa, and that was the time when Jews had to leave. So that whole period was a very rough one.
When you say they had to leave, which period are you talking about?
I'm talking about the late 60s or 70s when there was a mass Soviet emigration. There were thousands that came to the Bay Area. And they, from what I was told, was that they had to leave because they didn't feel they had any future as Jews. David, or yeah.
I think you've got the dates wrong. I mean,
No,
the,
because I was,
not the dates wrong. There was a migration in the 70s, but
no, I
mass
met,
migration was in the late 80s and early 90s.
wait a second, though. I knew Hal Light very well, and he began the Bay Area Council for Soviet Jewry in the early 60s. And both Hal, who was a close friend of our family, and Elie Wiesel, Joel
Yeah,
Brooks.
this is getting us a little off topic.
No,
here.
but they all came back saying that how horrible it was for the Soviet Jews, that was the beginning of it back then. And then many came to the Bay Area starting in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's when I met several of them the first time.
Well, there definitely was an immigration wave in the 70s. And look, I mean, some Jews felt that they really had no future in the Soviet Union, and that's why they chose to leave at that time. Others were more comfortable. They were more acclimated or more integrated into Soviet society. It also depends, because there was a lot of intermarriage in the especially in the post World War II years, and so it wasn't so easy. For not every Jewish family could say, well, we're Jews, we're leaving, because you might have a husband who identified as ethnically Jewish and a wife who identified as ethnically Ukrainian. So that complicates matters.
But it's certainly the case that in the late Stalinist period, there was an enormous wave of anti-Semitism that didn't really totally abate. So the question there is entirely relevant. I mean, in the 60s, there were a lot of people who certainly experienced anti-Semitism. This does explain the movement of refuseniks and so forth that ultimately culminates in the mass migration when the Soviet Union falls. So yeah, but you're right. There are those who certainly felt totally at home, and a lot of them remained as well. Other questions? Yes, Lawrence. You're muted.
Hello?
You're still muted.
Lawrence, you need to unmute.
Hello?
Okay, can you hear me
There you
now?
go. There you go.
I'm sorry. I was in Odessa about 10 years ago, and the Jews in Odessa could go in the streets with the yarmulke and with the shtreimel or whatever they were wearing, obviously Jewish, and they felt perfectly safe doing that. Was that also in Kiev, that the Jews could walk with their dressed as Jews and walk in the streets and feel comfortable?
I think so, yeah, because there are Jews in Kiev. I mean, most post-Soviet Jews, as I mentioned, are secular, and so they wouldn't. I mean, when they go out into the street, they would not be distinguishable from non-Jews. But of course, there are also a small number of Hasidim in Kiev, as in Odessa, and they go about in the streets as you described, with openly identifying as Jews. And I'm sure there have been anti-Semitic incidents, but generally, I think they feel safe, as do the people you mentioned in Odessa. Yeah.
So it's different than other parts of Europe where it's difficult to walk in the streets dressed as a Jew.
Yeah, I mean, the phrase I've heard mentioned a few times over the past few months is that Jews in Ukraine generally feel safer than Jews in France. I mean, that's obviously a vast oversimplification. And I was in Paris a few years ago in one neighborhood, and there on a Shabbos afternoon, and there were a lot of people walking around who were identifiably Jewish, and nobody seemed to be worried about it. So, you know, it obviously depends on the specific context, but yeah, I think it's certainly in comparison with what for many American Jews is the perception of Ukraine as a horribly anti-Semitic country, this comes as something of a surprise.
Also puts the lie to Putin's claim that he's waging war against Nazis.
Yeah.
Other questions before we adjourn for this evening? So Natan, thank you so much for a very enlightening talk. It's, I think, very important for us to get this historical background, to put things in context. We read about the news every day, but we don't get the big picture, and you've contributed to it really beautifully. So thank you so much to everyone. Stay tuned for Natan's course in the fall on the stepchildren of the shtetl. It's a wonderful book. I recommend that as well. And again, May 15th, Eddie Portnoy, Am Yisrael High, Jews and Cannabis. Please register. Thank you and good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Right.